Well, hello, everyone. You are at the Group of 78 webinar. And if you're at the wrong webinar, stay because it's going to be really interesting. This is the webinar on anti-inflation policy, green finance, and the climate crisis. And but first, I will give our land acknowledgement. I am first I'll say I'm the Vice President of the Group of 78 and Chair of the Climate and Environment Committee, and also happen to be the Vice President of the Ottawa Renewable Energy Co-op. All of these are volunteer positions. I don't know how many of you know about co-ops, but I'm happy to describe it to people should it be relevant later. We acknowledge that we are on the traditional unceded land of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, and that our organization and all of Canada have an obligation to participate in reconciliation. There comes all kinds of disputes about what really is a sincere reconciliation. So I'll say that Indigenous knowledge situates humans in a broader context of nature and says that we need to care for the natural world. And if nature does not thrive, then neither do humans. Loss of Indigenous perspective is clearly linked to the climate and ecological crisis that we are in presently. And it's very clear that it's a big difference from the organizational structure of both our legal system. I'm a lawyer, and I've noticed that with the legal system, not an economist, but I'm suspecting as I read this economic stuff that it's also true of our economics. And so reconciliation means that we honor this philosophy and its source. Which brings me to today's topic, which is all about money, anti-inflation policy, green finance, and the climate crisis. And we are fortunate to have a brilliant, out-of-the-box thinker. You'll find the bio in your package to help us discuss these issues today. And we also have our friend and collaborator, Mario Seccareccia. Oh, I did it wrong. I'm sorry, Mario. Emeritus professor at the University of Ottawa. And he will be taking your questions at the end. So over to you, gentlemen.
Well, all right. Thank you very much, Susan. I have to begin. I'm Tom Ferguson. I'm the speaker. I'm not claiming to be in or out of any box, but I will do the best I can here. I have to say straight away that I usually begin for many years when I'm speaking, thanking the host for having me and saying how glad I am to be here. Since COVID, that's not quite so perfunctory, and I can easily identify with the Pope, when he said about a month ago, hey, I'm still here. Not everybody I know is, which is something of a problem. And since I got a slide deck, which I thought I would try to walk you quickly through, I'm going to drop most of my usual initial jokes. Like I was thinking of offering to swap Smokey the Bear for Dudley Do-Right between the United States and the Canadians, because it seemed to me it could play. I mean, we have a political system so corrupt that, Do-Right would be a refreshing change. And it seemed like you could use Smokey the Bear at least for a while. When we say Canada is much on our mind, I'm not kidding. Every time I go outside and inhale, I am reminded of this. But let me I want to share my screen. And then we hope the slide deck will come up. The last time I did a talk with some Canadians, I am not making this up. It occurred right in the cyber attack that turned out was on Microsoft, and it almost didn't happen. I didn't know it at the time, but that was what I had trouble getting on. Anyway, I want to talk about anti-inflation policy, green finance, and the climate crisis. And, I can put this pretty quickly. Now, I hope, yes. In a nutshell, let's try to summarize it. I think if you can't summarize things pretty snappily, there's generally something wrong with your things. I think movements to limit global warming are facing a real problem. All of everybody's strategic thinking about how to deal to stop climate change has been in a low interest rate environment. And it's also an open world economy and one superpower, but the changeover now, because we're living in a new world economy, that you remember the old George Bush, 43, not 41, when he announced we had a new international order. Well, we got a brand new one. I won't talk a lot about that, but you'll recognize the syndrome when I mention them. And this means that a lot of stuff that used to work in favor of climate change silently behind, still plenty of things are working in favor of climate change. Movements to contain that is what that stuff is. And all these trends that used to, I think, work for us now work against us. And so folks have to sort of sort out what they think. Now, three parts, I'm going to talk about, I want to start with stranded assets, which just means you're sitting there owning something that you'll never be able to make a payout on, to get a payout on. And then I want to talk a bit about, the real world challenges here, especially as central banks are raising rates to combat inflation. And then we'll talk briefly about what might make sense. All right, so let's start. The basic idea here is pretty simple. In the first paper that I could identify that really seemed to have a real influence on things was in 2009 in Nature. Some folks wrote a piece that their problem was simple. How much of the world's oil, gas, and coal reserves would have to stay in the ground if we weren't going to go above the fatal 1.5 degrees centigrade or so, or just, if you like, cook in our own juice. And they concluded that it was really a great deal of those assets would have to stay in the ground. Now, this occurred right after the financial crisis had hit, the biggie in 2008 that nearly ended everything for folks. And so the situation got to a lot of folks looked at this and said, oh my God, they're both countries and firms looked at this and just said, hey, what? We have a problem. If this is true, we're not nearly as rich as we thought we were. It's no secret that the Saudi Arabians were not happy, nor were a lot of oil companies. But that hit a lot of financial people who held shares in all kinds of things, stocks and bonds. And so the thought was, oh dear, we've just been surprised. Maybe we're going to get really surprised. And then they just, most everybody was caught unawares by the financial crisis in 2008. They had just had, if you like, the financial equivalent of Pearl Harbor. Hardly anybody saw it coming. You probably remember the Queen of Britain's comment of what went so terribly wrong, etc. And that got people, they started pulling out, not usually slag rules, but computers, and started trying to figure out just how much poorer are we among the various assets that we own. And so you could see this huge repricing start to take place. Now, what's particularly interesting to study, I'm running this because I really want to make a point, which is, if you follow this timeline, it's just number of publications about stranded assets. And you can see there's a bump there. And then, but as you go toward 2015, the Paris agreements and more international agreements, as the momentum builds on that, papers start to take off a lot. And this, you say, oh, there's not that many papers. Actually, 20 or 30 papers on something I mean, that's pretty, that in that kind of a financial world is pretty interesting. Now, that led immediately to people taking sides, and folks started running all kinds of studies. Do markets underprice? They were like nervous. There were studies to try to figure out, do you underprice renewable energies? Maybe people, why aren't people investing in more of them, if you like? Or do they actually catch all of the climate risks? That led to discussions in the financial world of people did studies saying, hey, you know what? The Bank of England in particular was buying a lot of bonds of producers of oil and everything else. Now, guess why? Often those are thought to be pretty solid bonds. Like, you know, if the company goes down, you got the oil. You know, and then somebody tells you you haven't got the oil, you have a problem. And that led to discussions in the financial world. Should central banks do something about this? There were claims like maybe we should make it much easier for central banks to pay better for green financial instruments. We should enforce mandatory stress tests on firms, scenario planning, all that, and even different reserve requirements if you had, say, a loan, if you made a loan to some renewable energy thing, maybe you could reserve less cash on it, which would mean you'd have more as a bank to earn something on. These discussions were all over the place, and the financial studies came to conflicting results. I will come back to that. The short, blunt answer on this is, boy, it matters by the time, because, of course, if you start and think about this just a little, you realize that, well, what's actually going on here is a kind of a bet on whether anybody will actually shut you down or not, or whether the whole earth will shut you down in some thing. And depending on your estimate of that, that's the threat to your, if you like, what you thought was your black gold. All right. Now, where folks came out on this, say 2015 to about 2018, was official thinking said, hey, you know, we really do have an information problem here. And we don't know what firms actually own in terms of threatened resources. We don't know quite whether the threats are all the same. There are whole sectors, obviously oil, gas, coal are certain, but you know, what else is threatened? So you got the Financial Stability Board, which is just an international organization funded by a bunch, an unsympathetic being would say, the usual sort of wealthy investors and firms and countries around. They established this task force on climate-related disclosures. And the Bank of England chair, Mark Carney, and Michael Bloomberg, he was just out, I think, as mayor of New York, to recommend changes in accounting and other practices of firms. Now, this is a pretty interesting move. It did actually happen. They did come in with recommendations. They were a lot of accounting, international accounting firms and qualification examining boards did actually push for those. Now, what that meant, if you just think about this, is if you ask a bank, how many loans do you have to oil companies? That is effectively then a judgment on how many of your assets might not be really worth what you were all claiming they made the loan for. Banks weren't enthusiastic about that. Oil companies, natural gas companies, coal companies, they all hated it. But the majority opinion in finance was, let's do information on a voluntary basis, typically. There was also a lot of discussion, however, about how do we think about the climate change problem. And the usual response was from most economists, and therefore most businesses and banks, was, well, we'd really like to stick it into the standard straitjackets of orthodox economics, where you just use the price system to fix everything. Now, the problem with the price system in this is, of course, like to the extent you're able to dump pollution on others, that's not into the price system at all. That was part of the problem, and everybody sort of figured that out. But the bigger problem is people would not deal with the coordination aspects of trying to fix it. In particular, this problem, the one I like to highlight because I think it's so important. Effective action on climate change requires states to sort of like connect A and B at the same time. You can't price that into a market except by a lucky accident. A classic example of this in development economics is, hey, you got some property you might want to develop out there. You may have to build a road first. In the case of climate change economics, your problem gets to be fairly simple. Build a renewable energy firm and apparatus that works. Then how do you connect it to your power grid? In the US and other countries, that's often a gigantic problem. There's just a ton of renewable energy in the United States that cannot get into the power grid to find a buyer. Now, that's not an accident because it's really a huge political problem. That's the sort of, and that's basically the problem with the average climate change discussion is the politics, or if you like, the political economy of it drops almost entirely out. I mean, you just have endless groups of scientists saying, we need to get yourself down to 1.5 centigrade, hold the rise to that, and then calculations and stuff like that. Then the physics of this stuff, I think we actually understand, and much of the biology. This isn't what's holding up the world progress on this. It's a classic money in politics problem because it's big stakes. I mean, if you're an oil company, you're not so keen on seeing your valuation deeply slashed. I mean, your first impulse has been, we know this now, we don't have to guess, to try to deny it. Then later you get into things like, well, we'll spend some of the money we make on renewables. We'll get back to that. Which is, what happened. And so what you saw is a political football from about, actually well before 2015, but especially after the Paris Accords. U.S. elections, I could talk forever about this. I am not going to do it today because I do money in politics. The Russians also try, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and some other countries that are, principally energy exporters of one type or another, usually oil, but not always. They're natural gas. They were also heavy into this sort of thing. But the interesting thing, if you try to sort of understand the evolution of green finance, is there's still a lot of support for this down till 2022. We'll get there in 1 second. And in particular, when you look, where is this coming from? It's coming from in finance and high tech. The finance problem being you still really have this problem, which is what are my assets that I think I own really worth? And can I get stuck with this? And of course, the high tech folks who are particularly numerous in, surprise, countries with a lot of high tech, you got vast chunks of that industry are trying to do substitutes either for renewable energy or electric cars. I presume you all know who Elon Musk is, so I'll be very brief and past that. What you might take as the high point of this, I think, was the Glasgow Alliance for Net Zero in April 2021. That Carney started that. Bloomberg and then Mary Shapiro joined him in the leadership team a little later. And what you got there is 400 or 500 major financial firms, including most of the world's large insurers, are all saying, okay, we're going to support net zero. We're going to move to this in stages. I think 2050 was the date there. And this was pretty interesting because it meant that if the financial firms pressured the energy companies or the fossil fuel holders, or just so we're not going to get into confusion, I will sometimes speak of the legacy fossil fuel folks, the legacy energy providers, the old-fashioned stuff that we're all choking on or heating the world for. That would be real pressure, and there's no question that big oil companies, not the small and the medium ones, were affected by this. Okay, Then we have the war in Ukraine. And what you see there is in the United States. It's not the only place where this happens. You might check the Gulf, Persian Gulf, and a lot of other places. But you've got efforts by the fossil fuel producers, oil and liquid natural gas being liquefied, you can export it. They put on a big effort to say, hey, you know what? The U.S., which was a huge energy exporter in the teens, we will not go into the sort of squabble between the Saudis, the Russians, and the Americans. We'll just say that in the early stage of COVID, the Saudis sort of established, I think, their dominance in the oil market. The Russians had to fall in line, and the Saudis had been trying, it's no secret, it's everywhere in print, to try to put the American shale oil producers out of business. They didn't succeed, but they did cut production way down. Anyway, the American producers then came back and said, hey, we have allies, and the world is becoming multipolar, not a term they usually used. But that was the sense of it. And so we're going to have to supply allies. Now, if you look closely in Europe, you will find that argument was actually much more popular among governments than they actually would say much in print. But this carries with it something immensely important. If you were going to preserve the U.S. role as a major exporter of LNG, you would have to accept building a whole bunch of major new export platforms. These are huge, they're expensive, they got to last. Firms won't do that if they think they can't be profitable for 20 or 30 years. Now, I noticed this at the time the big compromise first went through in what was called, for just political reasons, the Inflation Reduction Act. It was really actually more green energy or brown energy than anything else from the Biden administration, and Greenpeace picked it up a little later. They noticed that if you have all these platforms building, you have a problem, and that they were coming into Europe, especially in Germany was the idea. That led to what the Biden administration did was, you could say it, I won't describe it as Solomonic. After all, King Solomon didn't cut the kid in half. Thus, I prefer the sort of two horses, one going north, one going south strategy. The Biden people came in talking, they weren't talking Green New Deal. They avoided that term. The New Deal is unpopular among many of American affluent contributors, and they didn't use it. And in Europe, they got rid of the new and just went to Green Deal, but all of it were some form of investment program aimed at stimulating green energy and making it going towards sustainability. They kept with that program in the Biden administration. They also watered down chunks of it. They did lease more oil and gas. It is said now, leased more than under Trump. And it's changed a bunch of other regulatory issues. It's been very slow to move on that all-important transmission issue, which just in the debt ceiling accord just reached recently, that was kicked down the road for another couple of years, which is just nice to fossil fuel folks. Anyway, this then led to some international discussions that you really needed almost radar to sort of figure out what was going on, because nobody was willing to say very much in public. No, you could see it if you could look. What happened was then, okay, within the American business community, the point about the multipolar world economy, meaning you friend sourcing and things like that, we can talk about that if you're interested, which really means, your friends aren't necessarily friends, but anybody who has lithium, you'll try to make into a friend, for example. There was some resistance to Carney and that net zero already from American banks. Then they resisted a great deal more, and many left. Similarly, the oil companies had been generally talking a different game. They were saying things like, well, we're going to try to do either carbon capture and storage, which I am extremely skeptical about, because it's mostly you don't capture it and you don't store it. It's still going out. And they also were promising to do more renewable energy with all their profits. Well, in the last few months, since if you sort of think about this as a process from the outbreak of the Ukraine war on, more and more oil companies are just getting up there and saying, you know what, we're oil companies. Shell did it last week, which really shook up a lot of people. That was interesting because it's a European oil company. There's generally a difference for years in the rhetoric of American and the Shell. The Americans are typically, much more unapologetic. But this is definitely occurring on a worldwide basis. Simultaneously, there's all kinds of discussion and a good deal of evidence about the green bonds that are proliferating and that were being handled by a lot of asset managers. Greenwashing, as the saying goes. Now, this is pretty dangerous because obviously, to the point I made earlier about how close does effective action look on climate change, if you kick that horizon down out a few years, then everybody who's got oil and gas in the ground starts thinking about, we better sell quick. And so you can get a devil takes the hindmost situation. Now, there are some offsets to this, and we have to know them, but I guess for some reason, missing one slide. That's okay. I know what the content was. There are a couple of offsets here that matter. One is that the insurers in particular, they can leave that net zero, but they're not going to suddenly start making loans for stuff that's going to fall into the sea, for example, on the coast. And more chunks of the United States coastline have been sort of declared uninsurable. Like the insurers are just pulling back and you can't get insurance at any price. That typically leads to some pressures for state action, literally states in this case so far, not too much from the federal government, at least that's new. But that's real. It's also the case that because Republican legislators in both the U.S. Congress and many U.S. states have been trying to move various forms of legal power, everything from antitrust threats to making the state pension funds disinvest from firms that take net zero pledges. You can get yourself out from under that problem if you're an asset manager. In other words, you just say you're not going to do it. Then you just go on and do it. It is the case, for example, that agreements as to how to sort of get a uniform reporting code for how to assess firms, the sort of, if you like, second generation of that earlier Carney Bloomberg panel that I mentioned, that's going ahead. On the other hand, green bond issuance has fallen way off, although Bank of America just brought out one about 3 days ago for the first time. But green bond issuance has fallen a lot. I conclude that this stuff is quite real. Now, that's one problem, if you like, what you might call the war pivot, which has happened not just in the U.S., but the Europeans are part of it. It was ratified in a G20 meeting, which actually I noticed how the insurers left Carney formally right after that G20 declaration. This is only like less than a month ago there. The other problems that the climate change movement now faces is the problem with central bank policies. Ever since 2008, we've been living in a very low interest rate world. Once in a while, they would rise a bit, but even modest rises sometimes cause financial chaos. And the famous taper tantrum when they tried to cut rates in the United States had problems all over the planet briefly. But But once inflation broke out, central banks everywhere started kicking up their interest rates way up. Now, there's a problem here. It just hits, as Susan remarked to us just before we went on. Yeah, this kills ordinary people and small folks. Yeah, you get hammered. In particular, you're just basically using unemployment to fight inflation. That's the sort of basic move. I'll come to the special problem of that in a second. But first, get the special problem for climate change, which is renewable energy investments typically are, you have to put up large upfront investments, and then you basically you have to complete the windmill, right? You can't have a half-finished windmill and get any power from it, or your solar installation. Once you got it up and it's functioning, it runs very cheaply and it runs for years. It can pay back pretty fast. The cost of doing renewables is way down, as Michael Grubb and some other folks have emphasized. But what that means is, compared to, say, a gas-fired power plant, you probably have bigger problems. I mean, my colleague Servas Storm and I made this point in an article in The Guardian, which was a spin-off from another paper we did on why central banks were being stupid for fighting inflation by high interest rates. But this is a real problem. And it's like, in effect, you could just translate what I'm just saying into this, which is, if you're a fossil fuel producer, somebody just gave you a whole new moat called high interest rates to protect you from that. That's a problem. Now, let me just briefly talk about the interest rate story here. We're not going to have a discussion about central banks, but the basic point here is very straightforward, which is most of the recent inflation is supply driven. It's like you can't get it at any price, say, because of semiconductors. You can't get them, and you couldn't for a long period. You still have all kinds of shortages. And the newer stage of this, besides climate related stuff, which is real obvious, like suddenly your crops have problems. You just take the way, for instance, prices rose right after that dam went down in Ukraine. I mean, that pushed the world crop prices up of some crops 2 or 3%. Besides, and it hit some countries much harder that were dependent on those particular there. But you've got more climate change problems. You've got continuing efforts to change production location by firms because they think there's a risk from the, if you like, less friendly world order of globalization. I mean, people have been asking, how big is this? It's actually, I was looking at 8 or 10 industries investment numbers on this just yesterday. It's quite substantial. But what that means is you're looking at all kinds of stupid transition costs and supply shocks. So you're probably going to have to live with supply shortages developing from time to time. We nearly had a big one over a strike that was just settled on the West Coast, a near strike of dock workers. The problem in the central bank story there is, if you're trying to fight mostly supply-driven increases by raising rates, you really have to do a lot. You got to just throw people out of work in enormous numbers. You'd be much better off saying, hey, cut this crap, and let's work directly on the supply shortage. And I, like myself, taxing the wealthy. You don't have to take the money away. You can just tell them it was a device Keynes had proposed during World War II and was actually used for a while in various limited editions. You just tell folks who've made a lot of money, okay, we're going to pay you, we're going to take some of your money in bonds, we're going to pay you interest for them. No one is confiscating anything, and they're going to get paid a reasonable rate of interest and take that cash out of, if you like, circulation. And then you can get some pressures on prices down. This is particularly important because in the super low interest rates, and we did it not just once after 2008, we did it for COVID. You drive up securities prices bonds and stocks, and home prices in the United States to the moon. Really, the world's the largest increases maybe in history, for the largest wealth effects, if you like. A huge amount of U.S. spending shows that effect. Some other countries, I think, do too. Not all of them. You didn't have that in, say, Italy, but you do, I think, have it in real estate in Germany and for sure in Holland. And you have it also in the UK. Anyway, so the lesson here is you don't want the central banks to hold up rates forever. Better recognize wealth effects are real, particularly when they cut rates in troubles, and get the rates down. There's still the problem of what are you going to do, since now your utterly crucial renewable investments and things now cost more relative to other stuff, which leads me to my final point, and we can just discuss the implications. There's a lot of implications here. Is what do you do with fiscal policy, taxing and spending? Why do we care? All right, here's the problem. Rising rates means that government debt goes way up fast, and it snowballs when you start compounding it. I mean, if you're paying, it's okay if you're paying, it's not wonderful, but if you're paying 1.5% or less on government debt, that's one thing. If you're paying 4, 5, 6% on government debt, and every year, that's a big. So the pressure on governments to go, if you like, for more austerity, but they usually talk about debt consolidation, is very large. Now, the problem is there is, I think, one thing that is certain besides climate change in this world, and that is that raising taxes on the affluent is very hard. Raising taxes on anybody is difficult. But what the states do is therefore they look for user fees, privatizations, anything to keep from having to raise taxes. Now, your problem for climate change is this, and you can see it not in one, but in many countries in the last few months. I was recently in Germany, where a bill to push through changes in heating systems in Germany broke apart. The argument was that the government wanted to bring in heat pumps and make them mandatory, I think, from 2025 on. Somebody didn't do their math too carefully there, though, and it turned out that in many states, especially in the state, Germany has states too, Länder as they call them, in many parts, especially the old East Germany, the places broke out beyond a few large cities that flourish. And so if you told them you can only do heat pumps, most people out there simply could not afford it. That led to huge trouble. Something similar has happened in the Netherlands, where efforts to rein in agriculture, a lot of these efforts often try quite sensibly to limit the agricultural use of stuff that just creates enormous greenhouse gases one way or the other. In the Netherlands, for example, they had mandatory limits on how many new houses you could build in small towns. That meant a lot of farmers living out there, their children had to move away. You can imagine how popular that was. That has led to a whole new political party in the Netherlands that's doing quite well, calls itself the Farmers' Party. Now it's getting popular in the cities. In general, right-wing parties in Europe have gained adherence on this stuff. It's true in Germany. It's true in the Netherlands. Everybody knows about the yellow vests, which maybe are not clearly left or right too much, but you know what the problem was. It was well summarized by some of them saying, hey, look, Macron is trying to make us think about 30 years from now, and I've got to live to the end of the month. The U.S. shows this type of stuff. When you look at where's support for Donald Trump, it often turns out to be, and other Republican proposals, because the Republicans are right now in the U.S. organizing to try to sweep away the entire Biden climate change program. You'll find that it's in peripheral areas, meaning out of the central cities. not really suburbs so much, although some suburbs. But this is a real problem. And to me, it's saying that you've got, I mean, the technical term in economics would be multiple equilibria. You've got low tax and high tax equilibria here. And the pressures to squeeze ordinary people when you try to bring in climate change stuff that's very sensible intrinsically are getting to be unbearable, particularly since, remember, most of the population is plainly losing on inflation. This is not a wage-driven inflation, no matter how many times central bankers worry about it there. And so I conclude that the climate change folks now, us, if I may, me, I count myself in there, need to think very carefully. What are you going to do with central bank policies that are pricing, that are so expensive to do renewables? What kind of a policy do you want to make sure that happens? I mean, you can't leave it to the market. If you do, you can, high rates mean you're going to have these people around, fossil fuel guys around for the next 50 years, in large numbers. And so that's my suggestion. The problem of high interest rates, the problem of austerity under pressure to do fiscal consolidation, and the war pivot here. This is a triple punch, if you like. It's really dangerous. It's also brand new. Most people don't see it. They will soon. They have already learned this in Germany, where the heat pump legislation had to take basic modifications, where you had a whole new political party jump up in months and get actually votes and seats in local parliaments in the Netherlands. And you can see, I think, traces of this, though it's an argument in Spain, and certainly in France. Anyway, on this happy note, I'm glad to just stop and answer questions if people have them. I'm glad to be told something I don't know. I'm fine with that. So why it's wrong.
Well, thank you very much, Tom. Over to you, Mario.
Yeah, excuse me. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Tom, for this incredible overview of what we could call the political economy here.
That's right.
And what is it? Environmental issues and central banking. And indeed, I'm really happy that I think you've emphasized the fact that to achieve price stability, okay, it has to be compatible with global, environmental issues somehow. How can we abstract from that? And if we do consider in what way, do we handle that? Could it be done merely by tinkering with interest rates, which of course, even if we were to reverse that, let's say in this case, what has happened with the with the last while with raising interest rates, even if we're somehow miraculously would be able to, to reverse all that quickly enough, would this change anything at that level? And I don't think it would, unless we're able to, of course, move forward in different directions here. And indeed, as you emphasize also, is that, clearly over the last couple of years now with these rising interest rates, what we are doing is also slowing the renewable energy transition in a sense, which is, highly problematic. And I think what I think you've also sort of stated, which is that central banks ought to be, I think you've used the term in the article that you wrote with the service, ought to be servants, okay, of the fiscal side, which would be the critical one to try to address these otherwise almost, on the one hand, financially unbearable issues for any one group to address, okay, which requires huge investments, and some of those we would think ought to be public investments in a sense. And this only the fiscal authorities should be concerned about that. Now, what I would like to do is I'm going to start with, I will read out here, for you, the questions as they're coming along here. So far, I just got one here from Roy Culpepper. And then we'll go on, and hopefully others will come along there in asking questions that pertain to many of the concerns that you raised in this wonderful, discussion here and presentation. Now, let me read what Roy says here. Some climate activists apportion considerable blame for the climate crisis on unrestrained economic growth. 1, would you agree? 2, adherents to this view might argue that if anti-inflation policy and higher interest rates result in slower or even negative growth, might that not be a win for the planet and the climate? In other words, should we have a Great Depression?
This is the COVID could be good for you story, right? Because that's what you got under COVID. It was the first time, I think, by some measurements, greenhouse gas emissions actually fell a lot. I recall this discussion coming up in middle of 21. Look, all right, here's what I'd say on this one. First of all, is unrestrained economic growth going to have to take a lot of the blame for this? That question answers itself, of course, especially the unrestrained part of it. If you go into a country, say the Amazon, and start just leveling rainforest and doing whatever it is you're trying to do, log stuff, get minerals out of there, whatever, that's going to be an ecological disaster. You can also drive through the western parts of the United States, and I suspect probably parts further north in Canada, and sort of figure out, hey, this is unrestrained economic growth at its very worst. You got a moonscape or some dystopian movie scene. So that has to be true. Now, the next question is, what happens if we slow down? Just slow down. Well, what happens if you slow down is this. You're going to, under the present circumstances, you're going to convert the entire developed world into, you will forgive my plain English for purposes of clarity, a right-wing bastion. Now, that is not then going to cut emissions. In effect, you will, just take this one in the United States. What would happen if growth falls? I'm not telling you that Biden is wonderful. If you somehow got that impression out of my talk, you weren't, nobody, and I understand Roy is not saying that. That's obvious. But, if you want to turn policy over to the Republicans, go into zero. A good recession is one of the best ways I know to do it. When I'm asked, because I have to do this from a clinical standpoint once in a while, what are Trump's chances of winning the election in 2024? I always begin by saying, okay, look, first, there's this big unknowable at the moment, radical uncertainty, as we sometimes call it. How deep will the recession be? A deep recession, and you're going to have a fantastic counter reaction. After that, you're not going to like what comes next. Just realistically, I have always thought that the let's not grow story has never made political economic sense. Beyond that, it's not clear to me why it should. That is to say, I certainly think you can you can't fix every form of pollution, but you can fix a great deal of it. And a large chunk of it relatively easily. You could stop subsidizing large fossil fuel producers. Just a new report yesterday or 2 days ago from the World Bank on this. In general, when I hear large amount of investment required, I hear, hey, it's a lot of jobs that are required. I remember talking to a social democratic economist in Germany who just said to me, you know what, all these people who are worried about being unemployed, we can use them to refit apartments for only. Yeah, that was the Green New Deal. The whole genius of the Green New Deal was they brought out the job creating and, if you like, wealth creating aspects of that. I don't think the world would have been a loser on that. The problem was that all Republicans hated the idea. Many of the Democratic, including the entire Democratic congressional leadership, and for that matter, most of the Biden administration didn't like it either. I mean, you got what you got out of Biden because you have this funny hermaphroditic coalition in the Democratic Party. You got a big progressive wing that wants the Green New Deal, and other ordinary folks who are often pawns of some fossil fuel company, or more generally, though, high tech and finance, which were open to that. What you get in the Biden administration is a mix. I don't think, therefore, my advice is don't try zero growth for very long, because you will get something horrible coming out of that.
Okay, thank you. Let me go on here. Art Hunter poses the following question. Let me read it to you. The geopolitics of China, Russia, USA is troublesome, especially with the movement to opt out of the US dollar as the currency of international trade. What is the impact of this on climate change financing?
Well, all right. In theory, of course, you can finance whatever you want to do if you're a large country, and whatever currency you like if it's your own. I mean, after all, you're paying your own population. We'll set that off to one side. I actually don't accept that premise, but it's not material to most everything I'm about to say in that. I think stories about the demise of the dollar are hugely premature. People are confusing the possibility, and countries are definitely trying to do their bilateral trade without using the dollar. You can look at various agreements like that. You know, like when I read the announcement that the Saudis were going to take, what was it, renminbi for a while or something in there, I just remind people that, you know, after all, the Saudi currency is linked to the dollar. And you can pull this stunt as long as you have the other, each side can offer the other something of what they want. Otherwise, you quickly get into the situation that the Russians are already in with India. They've got this huge pile of rupees they can't do anything with. The Indians are not going to sell them downtown New Delhi. I mean, they're not going to buy a bunch of land or something like that, and they can't use it. The dollars, there's way too much concentration on the dollar, much less on intellectual property stories and things and international growth stuff in the long run. But that's a separate discussion. But you know, the bottom line on this is, the issue is, if you want to make investments, you can find a way to do them depending on what kind of a system you want to live in. And beyond that, I guess I'll stop. I could get into a discussion of what's currently happening at the World Bank and emerging market debt. I think that subject is too broad to try to start toward the end of a discussion of climate change. So I'm not sure if that completely answers the question. You can find, I mean, I think Mario and I basically agree completely that banks, you don't need to save to invest. Just print some money, anything the folks will take. You can always just tell them they got to take it and get going. Now, for small countries, because of the question of imports and what you need to do that, then we get into a more elaborate discussion of multinational production. But the basic answer on that one is, yeah, you can do investments. Will this be wrecked by a move to, I'm skeptical about the empirical evidence on this, but even if I'm wrong, I don't think it'll matter very much.
Maybe I should just add that I think it was Keynes, or certainly a lot of post-Keynesians have always been saying this, which is that, needless to say, the money or finance is not really a constraint, but what becomes a constraint, of course, is whether or not you're deemed credit worthy or not, etc. And that, to some extent, can be addressed through government, not only regulatory kind of structures that they put in place, but more importantly, also through public, spending again, or public investments, that will do the trick. So in that regard, it's never really finance per se. And it is true, however, in some developing countries historically, there have been, they face real constraints when it comes to the, exchange rate problems that they face because they're so over indebted, in currencies other than their own. And that becomes a real problem again, which, of course, then the issue is how does that is to be addressed, and it's not going to be addressed simply by merely getting rid of the US dollar as the, in that regard, I think, because it just creates other forms, of dependency.
Yeah.
And others. In any case, I'll go on here with the other question, unless you want to add something, Tom.
Just one point, which is just look at what's been happening with the Chinese renminbi. It's been falling. It's going to keep falling for a while, I suspect. It's very hard for me to see that, a falling currency replacing the dollar. This one I want to see.
Okay, let's go on with the questions here on the list. Here's one from Eric Helliner, and he writes, when discussing the role of central banks, the talk didn't mention much about China. As the largest carbon emitter, it is clearly central to the future of climate change. Its central bank took a green turn as far back as 2007 and had little to do initially with the stranded asset arguments that you mentioned. It also took a more activist approach that went well beyond the information-based focus that you mentioned. Do you have any insights about the political economy of its central bank approach to the issue?
Yeah, I've had a lot, without claiming to be a great buddy, I've had a lot to do with the People's Bank of China. I even co-led a conference with them once in this. But step back from the People's Bank question and just look at the Chinese story. There was a little piece in my slide there that I didn't highlight in my talk, which was that the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative has led to enormous amounts of finance for coal. And the Chinese keep bringing in coal all the time. One of the more crazy aspects of this world is that, it's now famous, and the International Energy Agency has a nice piece on this, that the Chinese dominate the solar industry. You know what? In China, they actually use a lot of coal-produced energy to get started on that. I mean, that's as crazy as this sounds. Chinese, I don't feel like singling out the Chinese for special opprobrium here. The U.S. role in this is, I hope you haven't missed my message. It's pretty terrible on this stuff. But the Chinese are no prizes for climate reduction. They continue to be a very large producer, and they are bringing on more and more coal at very large rates, and they're not really phasing it out. I think one of the big issues in international development is going to be what you're going to do about all these financed fossil fuel producer power things in the rest of the world. And Chinese have a big share of that. There's no doubt about it at all. And so the fact that the central bank did a few things is, nice, but they don't run climate policy or any other policy in China. And you have to watch on the main configuration there. It's not great.
Okay, I'll actually, salut Mathieu here. I'll go on. This is from Tim. There's a question from Tim Lash. He writes, thanks, Tom Ferguson. Your exposition gives an entirely new, for me, look at how the retrograde refusals to implement needed climate actions are not simply inexplicable evil, quote unquote, but are rational and systematically supported. I think this could make actions for change more identifiable and maybe even more doable. How to identify movable levers in Canada, then, is the question.
Okay, now look, if there's one thing I'm not going to do from south of the border is try to lecture Canadians. on how do you identify them in Canada. I won't even say the obvious one, which is, why don't you check out all the folks who are sitting on the board of American fossil fuel concerns in your various state governments or around them, if the conflict of interest law says they can't be directly in there right now. I mean, my sense is that the Canadian problems on this one look a bit like the stuff I've written about with my colleagues, Paul Jorgensen and Ji Chen, in some of our studies of American election financing. But forgive me if I back off that question for the fairly obvious reason, you're local. I'm not. I mean, I wish everybody well. Boy, do I wish everybody well, because, when the sun goes down at 2 p.m., I mean, it literally vanished. Streetlights were turning on in New York City about eight or 10 days ago. I know my daughter was calling me with a sense of wonder in her voice as it happened. And while that's partly stupid forestry, it's also climate change all over the place. So on this one, I want to beg off. I am not going to do Dr. Know-It-All. I have enough tendencies inbred already. You just don't want to. It's like, no, not a good idea.
Okay, no, absolutely.
May I add, it is time people in Canada did some serious money and politics discussions, and they haven't happened. I mean, I read the stuff that the political scientists produce in Canada. It's as insipid usually. It's a little better. On average, it is somewhat better. It's not greatly better, and there's not qualitatively a great increase.
Okay, well, that's something from some law here actually may want to pick up on. Okay, there's a question from Lynn Oliphant. Actually, that's sort of connected a little bit with the sort of recession idea there. But if overshoot of the human enterprise is the reality and a major cause of the climate crisis, is human society ready for a critical discussion of degrowth?
I think I've answered that one already. No, they're not ready. And you got to look, there's a big difference between talking to affluent people about this who are pretty comfortable and you cannot have income and wealth concentrating in the hands of the 1% and then go to people and say, we're not going to grow anymore, unless you deal with both of those problems simultaneously. The giant hole in the climate analysis that goes out is that folks seem to somehow manage to disassociate income and wealth distribution from all discussion of what's going to be done with climate policy. And you just can't do that because the world's real. It will come back and bite you, just as the drive to state consolidation of debts is biting in several countries right now.
Okay, here's another question from Mathieu. I have a question. I try to understand the link between a net zero transition and the interest rate increase. I think that one of the issues for the financial regulators is that assets and risks are mispriced. So with the interest rate increase, can we expect that this mispricing could be reduced and therefore contribute to a green transition?
That's partly a disguised version of Roy's earlier question, which is maybe if they just can't grow, things will get better. Now, I suggest that there may be problems with that one. But the other side of things are mispriced is, remember, and you will see contradictory impulses from this, just like there were when the Ukraine war started, there was a burst of effort and interest in renewable energy. All through Europe and especially in Germany. That's real too, because of the problem of, and the Germans are in a special position because of the way their energy prices are changing drastically in the long run. The American natural gas is a good bit more expensive than the Russian oil there. But there is, let's face it, you've got you're also giving the fossil fuel legacy folks a new lease on life. You're not going to like that at high interest rates. I mean, it's just going to cost you a lot more to replace, somebody's gas-fired boiler or something, or and a fortiori the coal or oil stuff. So no, this is not going to. I mean, the belief that the invisible hand is going to wave. I think the invisible hand is waving goodbye, not beckoning ever onward, if you like. But that I may be jaundiced. I often respond to help people say, if you want a happy ending, see a Disney movie. I can't. You'll have to actually sort of sort these effects out.
Okay, let me go on here. I think we'll take a few more questions, and
Sure, I'm not in a rush. I'm happy to do it.
I'll just try to finish as what we can here. Okay, this is from Henri Sader. He has 3 questions actually. Okay, let me start here. One,
after all, it's a 2-language country, right? Yeah. So.
Okay, one is, to what extent ongoing innovation and technological advancements, photovoltaic, wind turbine, energy storage solutions, nuclear fusion, can increasingly contribute to reducing costs and leveling the playing field with non-energy resources? Okay, that's the first question. Right. Now, I don't know if I want to do one by one, or maybe I should just...
No, it's fair. I'm getting... I don't mind trying to keep all 3 of them in my head. I accept the challenge, but it is easier to just say this. I think the best stuff on this is Michael Grubb's. I think those papers look, I'm the research director at the Institute for New Economic Thinking. Surprise, those are papers out of our institute. You can find them on our website. Grubb's stuff on the declining costs of renewables, I think, is exactly right on. I think his book on planetary economics, as he calls it, while it now needs an update because it's 8 or 10 years old, is still an excellent treatment. And, the answer is they should help a lot. Nuclear, I'm less persuaded about, but that is a long argument, and I don't sort of feel like going there today. And you know what the problem is. I mean, I remember 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl, and I remember all these guys. Look, I was teaching at MIT when everybody was walking around saying, it's just no problems with nuclear power, et cetera, et cetera. And then suddenly big cracks appeared in a reactor not too far from Boston. I mean, within 100 miles or so, as I recall. Everybody went, like that. Well, it all depends, I think. I'm not sold on expert diagnosis. Let me put it that way. I don't believe most systems work very well, and I'm not encouraged that, like a large number of the nuclear plants in the U.S. are basically the same type that were used in Fukushima.
Okay, the second question is, ongoing efforts are being made to internalize non-renewable fossil fuels externalities. In bracket, yes, subsidies, health costs, climate change costs, environmental costs, through a variety of mechanisms of carbon pricing, emissions, trading schemes, etc. Any practical consequences in leveling the playing field?
Yeah, there's a bunch of papers on climate, on taxes, carbon taxes, especially the one in Europe that works through there. Those have some effect. They don't have a big effect. I am myself extremely skeptical about the permit approach to that stuff because it builds in the profits of investment banks into the cost of the system. And I just don't see why we all have to pay Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley a bunch of money just to do permits. That, and the other side of it is the carbon tax. I agree, actually, they are of some use, our carbon price, not carbon tax. But they turn out empirically, what I think the best reviews on this tell you is they're not that much different from just having any good policy that seems likely to work as a whole. I actually think the Biden administration was smart not to try to throw in a carbon price into its thing. I think it would have had all kinds of political effects. And I read the literature, including some unpublished stuff that I was given access to early by the authors, as basically saying, you know what, you can get most of that by just putting in place effective policies of almost any kind, because that means that you've got to, you know, this is going to change over time, and you got to build, you got to reorient your own production and thinking around that. You know, where it doesn't work is where you just sort of preach at people, don't do much, and then not much happens. There's a lot of that too.
Okay, the last question here, actually, this one I wish Henri could be a little more elaborate. It writes, can the concept of a circular economy be applied to integrate those diverging two energy horses? Now, I'm not sure if those energy horses are both the renewable, non-renewable. I'm not. I wish I could be a little clear on this one, but I'll let you interpret if you can. If not, we'll just go on. Okay, what other questions?
Well, you know, everything depends on what you mean by circular. If you mean a completely integrated system, it eventually would be a goal, right? You don't want to be polluting anything. And you'd like to just, sustainability is almost in that sense, I suppose, circular. But, you know, you can get a lot by coming close to that, whereas you might go bankrupt trying to get the last 10% of some arrangement like that. And so the short answer is, yeah, it might be a useful thought. I'm not expecting it to be super practical in the next century. Okay,
the next one is back at Tim Lash here, who, remember, it was, I was looking back here to see what he asked, and it had to do with, to identify in Canada the movable levers that he had posed this question earlier. And he's asked now in general, says, okay, then in general, if not Canada. I'm not sure if maybe I should read it over here. But let me read it over to you just in case.
I remember the question.
Okay,
it's really, you know, I would interpret this to a very considerable extent as questions about money in politics, bluntly. And so, you know, the basics here, I think, are pretty straightforward. It helps that I had to give a lecture at Harvard just 3 days ago on precisely this topic. You know, you need public financing, not having candidates run on contributions from basically from the rich. It's the only people who can afford to do much in that, and corporations. You need to eliminate revolving doors, which these days are a speed of light story. I mean, it's crazy. And you got now many corporations in the US, and I'm sure because those corporations are also in Canada, they probably have it there too. What I call the trampoline, that is to say, they'll write your contract that gives you a bonus as you exit from your firm if you are going into, quote, public service. That is obviously ridiculous. And and the regulatory institutions need to be subject to all of these things. This won't quite cure your problem, but it would be a very substantial difference. Even where we've had limited public financing in the United States, along with enormous gobs of private money, I think even in those states that had it, Maine had some, for example, it probably improved things. It means that you don't have to spend all your time grubbing for cash from rich people in order to try to do something for the population. That's the basic tension. And if you don't fix it, it's a money and politics problem. This is where the income distribution and climate change questions cross in a different way from usually discussed.
Okay. Now here's another question, which in fact, I think when we were chatting earlier, Tom, I had mentioned that the Green New Deal is still something that is of great interest to at least Canadians on the left here that have taken up to some extent these views. And here's one from Irvin Waller. Can you talk more about the Green New Deal? This seems to appeal to younger generations. Will this get more attention in future elections? What impact is school and university education having on support for this Green New Deal?
Okay, the last question is a little hard, but the Green New Deal is like all this stuff that is a label rather than sort of clear species by itself, if you like, means different things to different people. But in the U.S., it certainly surfaced among the so-called progressives, AOC and others in the so-called squad in the House of Representatives, for example, but also Senator Markey from Massachusetts. The idea was, look, you need large amounts of innovation to get to sustainability. That's going to require large amounts of investment. There's nothing the matter with public investment. And if you could make private investment, bring it along too. And so the proposals take various forms, everything from smart electric grids to electric car subsidies of one type or another, with a very distinct emphasis on job creation. I would add that a lot of this really matters, and you can see how tricky it turns out that in the US, most of the jobs in installing solar panels are not unionized. You can do a low wage story on that one, or you can do a higher wage story on that one. I mean, anybody who thinks you just deduce the shape of a job structure from an idea, think again. That's to get us to that's a different lecture. All right, and the thing was, the Biden administration was very skeptical. Nancy Pelosi, who was then Speaker of the House, or leader of the Democrats, depending on how they were doing in that whatever election cycle you're talking about in the House, was very opposed. And it's fair to say a huge number of other folks were opposed. The Green New Deal generally came along with a tax package that would have been a substantial reform too. You can imagine how popular that was among an unsympathetic being would call corporate Democrats. But in the end, the Biden administration sort of looked at all this stuff, and then it took pieces of it. Now, what it did is it tended to take the parts of Green New Deal subsidies that could be put into taxes and then used that would be attractive to private capital. It had a producer bias, I think is fair to say. It had a consumer bias for the introduction of electric automobiles. You get very large tax credits for trying those out. Now, this is the type of thing that is a solution only briefly, because I can tell you, because I actually looked up the numbers on this. You know what the average cost of a new car in the United States was in recent months? $47,000. That's a lot. That's for sure a pile. I'm sure an average that sort of has a pile of Teslas piled on top of lower averages to get it up that high, as it were. It's not a sustainable situation if the bulk of the population is being asked to finance tax breaks for rich people to buy cars. On the other hand, you got to get these things into production. The production costs should come down over time. I mean, economies of scale are real in that stuff. And indeed, it might be happening a bit now. But this is the type of problem I raised earlier about, if you like, high and low tax equilibrium. But the bottom line on this is that's the Green Deal, and it's the Green New Deal, and its general outline. And the one you've got is actually got a huge producer bias, but you really have it. There really are tremendous amounts of private capital pouring into this, to the extent that the Europeans are sitting around looking at each other and saying, how do we do this? I mean, I know because I got stopped and asked in Berlin by one German institution, how can we find out exactly what's in the Green New Deal? And there's a lot of folks looking at this stuff. So I guess that's about all I can say without repeating myself. Not a good idea.
Okay, thank you very much. Actually, just a little note here. I got Yes, Tim, very much appreciate your answer there. And also, Henri clarified it's about zero entropy. Now, I don't think we're going to get into this one right now, but I do want to ask one question that I think kind of is there. I mean, especially over the Green New Deal connection. As you know, the topic here being central banking and the financing of of green, whatever you want to call it, investments and all that. There it's pretty obvious here that Green New Deal, there was a kind of MMT connection there as well, that it sometimes has been established. And one simply saying, well, why can't we just simply get central banks to purchase, newly issued, let's say, whatever financing of these various green investments? Another one, which would be a kind of almost, I would call it, it's a kind of flip side of this, because we have been engaged in QE big times until last year, and have done that now a couple of times on a huge scale. Okay, what would be wrong with getting, again, in this case, getting central banks to purchase not the new kind of, newly issued securities or whatever, but existing securities where they would privilege the purchase of green assets?
Okay, look, on the MMT, modern monetary theory, I am much more skeptical, I guess, than lots of folks. I thought MMT, I basically agree with my friend Lance Taylor, who wrote a great piece on this. MMT was a mix of Abba Lerner's fiscal theory, which is the real Keynes, and then stuff that was highly questionable monetary economics and history. And I like Lerner and Keynes. I didn't like the money side of it, but that's a dispute for another day. Your basic point is, how come central banks can't do this? The answer is, of course, they could. The point I was making in my talk from a clinical standpoint, it was this traditional distinction between monetary and fiscal policy. Boy, you could see the discussions from about 2015 on among central bankers get very intense on this question. The argument was basically this, and it's not a stupid argument, which was that you got legislatures to vote spending. So let them do expenditures and have monetary policy be issues about refinancing. Now, of course, they threw that completely overboard as soon as the entire financial system, in other words, their system, looked like it was going down the drain. And they just bought everything. When you hear can't central banks buy green assets? Well, they bought all this junk. They were even, my favorite stuff from 2008 was when the wives of two, I think it was Morgan Stanley partners, set up a firm and were selling assets to the Fed too. That's just crazy stuff. There are all kinds of garbage that central banks were buying, and they would periodically print these stories about how everything was really paying off. No, it wasn't, and they watered down the stories. I know this is not, we can't get started on this. I could also become like fit to be tied, and I might throw a fit of apoplectic. So we'll put that there. Could you do this through the central bank? Sure, you could. The difficulty is, boy, will you derange the financial system that we currently have. I'm not saying that's not necessarily a bad idea, but you'd have to have some pretty comprehensive reforms, and you can't have it headed by the people who currently run it. Look, the reason you could just see the Bernanke in particular, the reason he got that job as head of the Fed, as far as I can tell, is he wrote those articles supporting the Greenspan line, which was that bubble. Who can tell bubbles? I was thinking at the time, 100 to 1 or price earnings ratios probably ought to be a bubble. I don't think that's real complicated. But he got the job, and then, basically had a sort of throw overboard, didn't see the financial crisis coming. We all know that. And then they rescued They had to do the systems bending. Then he gets the Nobel Prize and goes off and makes zillions of dollars. This is crazy, folks. Sorry, but this doesn't make sense. It's not good economics. And it's, you know what? It's worse politics. So I think realistically, you could try the following. I mean, one is you could try to make the case a lot of people did. This would be extremely interesting, but I bet most of the climate foundations will not touch it with a 50-foot pole. You won't even be allowed to hear the argument much, which is sure you could do. You could just tell the central banks to take, 10% of all their assets on green assets that you actually had to, monitor for not being greenwashing. Sure, you could do that. You could also, if you want to sort of keep something more traditional, you could probably set up an investment bank with an appropriation, sort of like the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the New Deal. It worked on balance sheet from the government and gets an allocation, and or sort of like the European Investment Bank, actually, and just say this is going to be used for green stuff. That's about as far as we got in the European discussion, was have the European Investment Bank do something, which of course was not the European Central Bank. And the European Central Bank led not necessarily in terror, but very, let's say, unenthusiastically from that prospect. So yeah, you could do it. Look, if you need financing, you can always get it. It requires a political will. But the climate change movement now, anti-climate change movement now needs to sort of sort out what it thinks about this stuff. My friend Servus Storm and I wrote that piece in The Guardian and just said, why don't you just do something about this? That got a ferocious reaction, unlike almost anything I ever wrote. Maybe not had a lot of people liked it a lot. But, the climate movement needs to think very carefully about this. You may not be interested in history now, but history is interested in you. And the stuff that used to work to make things go fairly easily isn't working anymore at nearly the same pace and speed.
Okay. On that note, I think we could, well, let me first just thank you. Thanks so much for having spent this, almost 90 minutes here.
Thank you for having me.
To present to us and really offer some kind of overview, but also important insights on the mechanisms and the issues that are currently at stake. So on that note, thank you so much on behalf of everybody. I'll maybe get Susan also to say something, and she could offer her last bit on this. Then I'll stop here. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. I wanted to get into a long debate about grids and distributed energy, but I knew that didn't quite fit with your topic today, because that's something we're looking at in the Ottawa Renewable Energy Co-op in terms of resilience. But it was a wonderful and broad scope of what you talked about today. In fact, it was like 2 or 3 courses all in one. So thank you very much for your contribution to our session. And we do have it recorded, and I'm sure there will be quite a bit of interest in that. So thank you again very much.
Well, thank you for having me.